Hey, how's it going, everyone? Just wanted to welcome everybody back for Game Journal 3. Today we're going to be doing something a bit different than the previous two and stepping away from the Borderlands franchise and actually going with something a little more controversial this time, that being the game Fallout 76. Before we start the video, I do want to kind of preference this by saying that there is no spoilers in the background. It's just me kind of roaming around the world doing some public events and just kind of just killing time. That said, the game itself did launch into memes and mockery when it was originally released, but somehow has clawed its way back into a weirdly rich cultural piece of entertainment. I want to look at it as not just as a survival RPG, but through the lens of game studies and theories, pulling ideas from Enfield and Nelson's video understanding video games, plus some of the foundational readings that we've had throughout the semester from multiple articles from Jenkins, Frasca, and Sickert. That said, altogether, this helps us understand Fallout 76 is more than just a buggy multiplayer spin-off into a living world that tells us a lot about how games communicate meaning, how players create narratives, and how virtual spaces can become stages for serious reflection on the community, loss, and survival. That said, let's start with Chapter 6 that kind of ties in here from Understanding Video Games, where Enfield and Nelson and co-authors talk about games as a cultural artifacts, not just entertainment, but reflections of societies themselves that produce them, right? They argue that games participate in culture the same way that films and novels do, by expressing values, ideologies, and social tensions. When Fallout 76 came out in 2018, it was in a world of isolation, or in a world of isolation, environmental collapse, and kind of post-apocalyptic themes. Kind of sounds familiar to Borderlands themes, which seems to be a passion of mine. Appalachia's wasteland, though, however, was empty yet networked, right? Mirrors of our own connected but lonely digital lives themselves. The game became kind of accidentally commentary of those anxieties, right? Even in its multiplayer design, it reflects cultural shifts. After years of single-player Fallout games about your own personal story, 76 tried to force players into collective storytelling with one another. That said, a pretty major cultural turn from the individual heroism to collaborate more on a survival front with your friends and create your own kind of stories about survival. Enfield Nelson, though, would say that this shows how games can kind of mediate culture, right? They absorb trends like online society, and then kind of re-express them in play. But culture isn't only really represented, it's produced. Players create entire communities, trading posts, role-play towns, and radio stations. Fallout 76's world, though, became a site of cultural production where fans built meaning beyond what Bethesda actually wrote into the actual storylines of the game itself. This brings us kind of to Chapter 7, where we kind of discuss narrative quite a bit in the chapter. It frames that the long-running debate, are games stories? Do they tell them, or do we just kind of impose them on ourselves? Enfield and Nelson explain how the so-called ludology versus narratology debate shaped early game studies. Ludologists emphasize that systems themselves and mechanics, and then neurologists emphasize the story and representation. In Fallout 76, though, the tension is front and center, right? There's no traditional narrative delivery and no main story quest driven by NPCs at launch. It was pretty much just a barren wasteland, empty world, and kind of like a sandbox, if you will. Instead, the story itself, though, comes from the terminals, holotapes, and any player interactions that was held in around the world itself. Here, Henry Jenkins, from the article "Game Design as a Narrative Architecture," became really useful in kind of understanding the game itself. Jenkins argues that games tell stories not through linear plots, but through spaces he calls this narrative architecture. Fallout's Appalachia, though, is kind of built like that. It's a world where every ruined cabin, abandoned mine, as you'll see in the background in a bit, or even a half collapsed fairgrounds, hints at a story, right? The player itself's task isn't to read the scripts, but to explore one. So Fallout 76's narrative is kind of spatial and kind of environmental. It's not a story that's told to you. It's more of a story that you kind of uncover throughout the gameplay itself. And in multiplayer context wise, these environmental cues become props in a collective environment itself. Out of the article itself, I have no words. I must design. This also helps frame this. The author argues that the game's communication style the communication style is a means through the systems, not words. Fallout 76's scarcity mechanics, for instance, design a story by rebuilding a society by making cooperation more effective than actual conflict. Even if Bethesda did not write that moral in the cutscene, it's built into the game's rule system. Excuse me. In telling game stories, Fraskia, I think is the correct pronunciation, reminds us that the games aren't just narratives in the traditional sense. They're simulations. The model behaviors and the consequences of Fallout 76 stimulates the ethnic ethics of community. Stimulates ethics of community. Do you hoard? Do you grieve? Do you share? Do you rebuild? Really, it's kind of up to the player itself, right? Every play session becomes a little bit, I guess, a little bit more of a social experiment and trust and resilience, because no matter what you do, anybody can kind of impact what you're doing on any level while playing itself. Like I said, Miguel Sickert's against procedurality pushes back on the idea somewhat that the meaning comes from the rules of algorithms. He says that no meaning is co-created by the players. Their ethics, their interpretations, and emotional investments matter as much as any designer's intent. Fallout 76 is kind of a perfect case study for this. Early on, critics said that the game felt pretty much empty procedural systems without really any soul, but somehow another players filled the emphasis with creativity. I do remember originally playing and thinking, like, what is the point of this? There's no NPCs. The game was barren, right? There was just things to shoot at and things to collect, which was kind of, you created your own story. That said, though, Sickert would call this kind of a playful resistance to procedural meaning, but players didn't really just play the game. They kind of reclaimed it to their own. So if procedural rhetoric is the idea that the rules make arguments only explain half the story, the other half lies in the kind of messy human improvisation that happens inside those systems, right? Fallout 76 for short. Its world became strange in a way for a lot of people, because it makes you kind of have these moral choices in finding meaning throughout the the engagement, not just the actual design of the game itself. That said, kind of moving to kind of roll into chapter 8 of understanding video games. It kind of focuses more on the serious games that are kind of designed for, we'll say, education, activism, or social critique. 76 wasn't marketed that way, but it accidentally focuses as a type of serious game. It makes us think about post-disaster survival or kind of core operation, and kind of how fragile civilization actually is, which all of the games has always done. And if we kind of scratch the surface of, I think it's Quaestian and Jenkins's frameworks a bit, we can kind of see that the architecture of Appalachia invites this reflection. It's hauntingly beautiful, but baroque and filled with all kinds of echoes of lost lives and mutations of creatures and people themselves. The environmental storytelling forces us to kind of confront decay and the continuation of how society can be crumbled and be rebuilt at the same time. In a sense, Fallout 76 is kind of both a leisure activity and a meditation on resilience. It embodies kind of what Chapter 8 calls the environmental plus or entertainment plus fun that kind of makes us think, right? The game itself is extremely flawed, but it also kind of forces people to work together in such a strange way that it all works now with all of the updates. So that said, to wrap it all up through the lens of Enfield Nelson and Company, Fallout 76 sits at the intersection of culture, narrative, and serious play. It's a game that kind of mirrors our own social anxieties while offering a sandbox for rebuilding a community. This also teaches us to look at its systems and kind of explain this, understand the spaces that we are narratively and creatively. Jenkins also helps us read into these spaces, and Fresca reminds us that if it's a simulation of choices, it works extremely well. The meaning comes from us, the players, finding stories in the wasteland kind of together, which is kind of interesting because Fallout 76 may have launched broken, but it's like the wasteland itself, right? It's a story about persistence, about people making meaning out of ruins, and maybe the most serious thing about the game is exactly what it can do, right? I hope this was a little more interesting than the last two itself, since they're both Borderlands. But this game's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine. I've always been a Borderlands, or excuse me, a Fallout fan, and I really hope that they continue on adding to it because the game itself is really awesome. But yeah, Game Journal 3. Thanks for hanging out, listening.